during um, seeing such high levels of violence, both toward media and then media kind of getting caught up in general protest violence over the past year. So one thing that we have been working on is trying to figure out how to get some sort of media training for police so that they can be proactively informed about how media should be treated at protests to perhaps prevent future violence. Also creating accountability mechanisms for press freedom violations. So curtailing the supply of military grade equipment that is sent to local police units if they commit press freedom violations, something that we've kind of been looking at. It's really difficult to get people to bite on that though. And then more broadly, the curtailment of police militarization, which we have identified and discussed at great length in various articles and in this audio feature about what the militarization of police does from a safety perspective for reporters who are out covering civil unrest in ways that, because of the federal pipeline of allowing military grade equipment to be redistributed to local law enforcement. Oops. So I apologize for the lack of specifics on taking action, but really it's just kind of keeping abreast of issues such as police militarization and looking at ways that local policy could perhaps prevent the free flow of information. And then kind of, I'm sure you guys have all done some like very active chapter calling your state and federal representatives. If kind of looking at more global press freedom initiatives, I highly recommend taking a look at Free the Press, where CPJ highlights various cases that we think are especially acute. And then One Free Press, that is a list of kind of important time-sensitive cases that we've identified that we and partner organizations have identified, that we feel need to be addressed. And then another way that you can kind of keep up with things that are going on across the country and globally is following us on social media. Apologies for the shameless plug, but we send out regular updates on and statements on changes in policy or arrests, detentions, assaults, etc. Through these channels. So that is all. Stop sharing now unless you guys want me to keep the.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Catherine. So far we have a couple of questions from Howard. Howard, can you unmute yourself and ask your questions, please?
Yeah, Catherine, are you dealing with more problems from left-wing or right-wing regimes, basically nationally and internationally in parties?
Do you mean, well, could you kind of be more specific? And
okay, are most of your incidents of press abuse just police overacting? Are most of them due to QAnon kind of conspiracy types like you had with the Washington deal, or is it just basically a mix, about equal on both sides, that the press is getting it from both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see a lot more with, or what we've seen a lot more with kind of the QAnon strain of anti-media sentiment is online harassment, which we probably should have gone into greater depth about, but and that's really kind of a weird gray zone, right? Because it's hard to say sometimes when, excessive hatred on Twitter will turn into someone showing up at your doorstep, or when any sort of other disinformation campaign on another platform will result in someone doing something else, right? But that certainly does happen, and it's again hard to quantify also because sometimes it's dealt with internally. Sometimes newsrooms are very proactive, and it's not something that you really want to report on and then draw more attention to, because that only kind of fans the flames. And then more broadly, though, a lot of this press freedom violations that we've seen are that are perhaps more recognizable and easier to track, are from law enforcement in protest situations where, yes, there's certainly the cases where journalists just kind of get caught up in the general, chaos that protests turn into when dealt with a heavy hand. But then there are certainly also cases where reporters have been targeted specifically because they are media covering these events and don't want, and law enforcement's not happy to have them there.
Yeah, the other two questions I had were kind of, has there been any attempt to sort of establish standards, that if you've ever, I'm dating myself here, if you've ever seen the old movie La Dolce Vita, the freelance photographers who were once referred to in Italy as the paparazzi. In other words, they were people who would go out looking for a story with the camera, and then they would try and provoke the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how much of that you're seeing. And the other question I had was that with the recent hijacking by the Belarusian government, have journalists begun to reach out to links like the International Air Transport Association to say, hey, you've got to help us protect ourselves because otherwise they're going to completely foul up your lines of communication.
Mm.
I'm saying, in other words, you have another dog in this fight, a bigger dog that might help you.
Right. I can't really speak to my colleagues' work on Belarus because I'm not involved in the nitty-gritty of that. But I know that we've been working more, I guess, with journalists on the ground to see how that we can, help provide medical costs or help kind of leverage various bodies to help them in different situations. As far as the La Dolce Vita thing, I mean, it's we're not really keeping track of. I should say we evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether or not someone's committing an act of journalism, and I think it's really important to go through that those procedures because kind of establishing a definition of what is a journalist and who is a journalist and leaving that up for some government entity to make that determination is very problematic because then the government gets to decide, right? And I think it's perhaps easier sometimes to figure out what is an act of journalism, who is doing that in that particular situation. So I haven't seen personally an overwhelming number of provocateurs, but those that we are, we classify, I mean, you recognize, when you see it. Right?
Thank you, Howard. Okay, so Bob has a question about the BLM.
Yes, we've been hearing from the far right that they're not as violent or as the Black Lives Matter movement and those groups and that the press is showing favoritism toward the left when it comes to Black Lives Matter and all these other things, and that the Proud Boys and all are no worse than what we're seeing on the left. Could you speak to that?
I can say from the perspective of journalists and from what I've heard and what we've documented, I think we have dealt with a lot more cases of journalists being harassed and targeted by groups like the Proud Boys than we have of journalists being targeted in any systematic way or any kind of with a narrow focus on journalists by Black Lives Matter protests. The cases that we have seen of rogue actors at protests, trying to prevent journalists from documenting something, it's been done out of a sense that we do not want our faces out there for safety reasons, right? And there's a different tone to it, right? There's a different, I mean, it's hard to subscribe attent or like give attent to people who I've never spoken to before, but it's my understanding from speaking with the journalists that things get a bit hairier when dealing with groups like the Proud Boys than with Black Lives Matter protests. But it's, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
All right,
Thank you.
next in line is Bridget. Bridget, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Sure. I was wondering if there's either you or some other organization brings up any legal action against police departments or an individual for violating freedom of press. I mean, I don't really know the legal things about that right that we have, but it seems kind of built into our Constitution. And if there's any kind of legal actions around any violations of that, and if you could speak to that.
Right. So first of all, I should say that I'm not a lawyer. I do not understand. This is based on my conversations with lawyers. We have a partner organization that we work, or not partner, but an organization we work quite closely with, the Reporter Committee on the Freedom of the Press, and they are a lot of lawyers who are really great at looking into these things. But there is no special protection, no special legal protection afforded to journalists in protest situations. So it's the First Amendment, but and the protection against unreasonable search and seizure, but that's, it doesn't, there's nowhere in law that it says specifically that journalists in these situations are allowed to act. It's all based on, you know, traditional legal precedent and an understanding that reporters, whoever they may be, whoever decides to find them and such, are allowed to be there. And so that's when it gets kind of hairy. And especially as the understanding of what media is has evolved so much over the past, what, like 10, 20 years. It's also harder to recognize journalists sometimes, right? Because everyone has a cell phone, but at the same time,
Well, the Department of Justice of the previous administration was secretly seizing records of reporters of three leading news organizations here in the US. Okay. And now we have a new administration. And in today's Washington Post, there was a opinion piece saying that that practice is continuing today. And the current administration has not stopped that. Can you comment on that?
I wish I could. I wish I knew what was going on inside the bowels of the Justice Department. I think it's positive that the Biden administration has, or that President Biden himself has said that he thinks it's important to issue these sort of secret subpoenas against journalists. But I also think that it's really important to fully understand what happened in the Trump administration and why only now we are learning about, you know, however many months into the administration and to Biden's administration, we're now just learning about these subpoenas, the secret subpoenas, right? And to create some sort of mechanism or perhaps federal shield law that would protect journalist-source relationships and kind of enshrine it in a federal code. But it's ongoing efforts to do so.
Next question is from Bert. Bert, you want to unmute and ask your question, please?
Sure. Do reporters ever choose to not write about something because out of fear of the reaction they may get from extremists? I know sometimes reporters are known personally and get personal threats and their families. Does that ever happen, or is that, or not?
I mean, it's hard to say what doesn't get published, right? but I will say that I tried to report on a story about the safety considerations that journalists who report on extremism take, and some of them are very willing to speak about it openly, and some of them did not want their names to be used. Right, the people who are willing to speak about it openly have usually already been doxxed, so their personal information has been out there, and they've kind of been through that whole process of protecting their information and figuring out what comes next after that. But those who have managed to avoid it, especially people who were putting QAnon like last year ahead of the election, were very reticent to speak about their experiences or really draw attention to themselves, because the problem is you don't know at what point in time your name or article is going to show up on Reddit and get worked into the daily Q machine.
So,
Hey,
sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing at times.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I mumble sometimes. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to say when your name or information might turn up in a Reddit thread that somehow gets turned into a Q conspiracy of the day or something like that. It's kind of a crapshoot, for lack of better words. And so people are reticent to talk about their experiences or draw too much attention to themselves, right? As far as reporting on that, because you open yourself up to more attention. Yeah.
If nobody else have, Bert, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought I clicked it. But wouldn't that be true for submitting stories also? That I mean, I'm just looking for some like anecdotal. Do reporters talk to each other and say, you probably really shouldn't submit that. You're going to get in trouble with QAnon, or does that ever happen, or is that a problem, or widespread problem, or is it just pretty rare and just stuff for movies and television?
I mean, I'm sure it does. It's hard for me to say if, I'm sure there's some incident somewhere at some point in time where that has happened. Yeah, it's just hard for me to say, like, to point to a particular case, because the stories, again, that don't get published are harder to pinpoint or draw. And Howard, I just wanted to go to your comment really quickly. I'm almost positive there's not a federal press shield law, because we're working on drafting legislation at the moment for that, but there are state shield laws that kind of function in certain ways. But it would be, anyway. Just want to.
Thank you. If you're interested in a situation where you have a conservative press and a lot of the incidents you're going or describing, there's a group of books called Pacific Trilogy about World War II, in which you have Roosevelt administration, the conservative press fighting over the whole issue of what could be published and what couldn't. And you'll find a lot of stuff in there. The Missiles of October, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, has got a liberal press and JFK dealing with that and actually using the media to communicate with the Russians at the same time, and people asking what should we say and what should we not. So there is a lot of historical stuff, at least in the foreign field. I don't know if any references to talk about it. Well, actually, there's a book called "The Killers of the Flower Moon" about the Osage murders in Oklahoma during the 1920s, and it has a little bit of the FBI and the press in there too. Enough said. Yeah.
Mohammed, if you could you put those? I've forgotten to bring my pen with me, so if you could put those two links on about free the press and what have you, so we can contact our legislators, I would appreciate it.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
yeah, I can share if Catherine gives me the permission. I can share her presentation with all the membership.
Yeah, that's fine. And also, I was just going to send a follow-up email after this with links to the free press stuff, and then also to a few follow-up articles from CPJ, as well as a link to our podcast, so you guys can check that all out.
Bob, did you want me to do it right now, or can you wait?
No, right after the meeting, it'd be fine. No problem. I just wanted to make sure we got that because some of us do contact our senators and, so.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah, I made some Senate calls to the senator this morning too, but it was on a different subject.
Yeah.
Can I just say something in response to Bert's question? I'm a member of the Investigative Reporters and Editors, and I've never heard any members of that organization say, well, I'm not going to do that because it would be too dangerous. So I think people who are doing stories where they might be putting themselves at risk are doing them anyways. But if you have a newsroom behind you, as opposed to being a freelancer, it's gives you more courage, I think.
Changes the calculus.
That's reassuring. Thanks, Reese.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
But okay, so on that subject, okay, is there any pressure from the editorial board on reporters or journalists on what to say or what not to say in their reporting?
Yeah, I can't really speak to that. That's more of a workplace issue, and we don't really deal with workplace politics on how that's also supposed to shake out. Yeah, we kind of veer more towards safety practices and ways that editors can assist journalists to kind of proactively think about safety, whether it's digital safety or physical safety when they go out and report. So, a lot of those things are thinking of what personal information is available online, especially if you're going to report on a more contentious topic or do investigative stuff, how you can kind of scrub as best you can your personal information or make sure all your social media is locked down, that sort of thing. So.
You don't run into anything with respect to organized crime and police investigations or the intelligence community and ongoing military operations that never comes up compromises or trade-offs that have to be made between the editors and the reporter?
I'm not privy to those conversations, so I
Yeah.
can't really.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Susie or Sherry Germain, Sammy?
No, I think this is very informative.
Okay. I do have one question. Well, I don't know. I mean, you worked in Ukraine and Russia as a reporter for 3.5 years. How does that experience compare to working in the U.S.?
It's very different, but it's also very similar. It's interesting there. I think there's a certain cynicism with media consumption, and born out of years of Soviet media, basically, and that carries on to today, right? That who owns media stations or television outlets, and especially in Ukraine, and it's very clear, like, who you can turn on the channel and figure out pretty quickly, like who owns what, and who's paying for it. And I think in the United States, there, at least until more recently, there was a sense that I don't think people were as savvy when turning on some channels, perhaps, about what was being said and why it was being said, or especially like delving into blogging worlds and that sort of thing. And it's interesting. I think that, and I hope that the American public is kind of becoming more savvy about figuring out where information comes from, and it's kind of to Bert's question also about combating misinformation and making sure you understand like how to triple check the source, or thinking about why the story is configured differently on various news websites, why Breitbart is different from the New York Times, like kind of putting the pieces together. And it's my hope, faith in my fellow countrymen, I guess, that going forward, especially after the previous administration, that people will look for answers and kind of interrogate their media sources more. I think that's through education, understanding, and also dialogue, kind of with with those relatives who might have gone down the QAnon rabbit hole, and having uncomfortable conversations. Again, I realize this sounds very glass half full and perhaps too kind of rosy for the reality of many things, but I think, again, rolling my eyes at myself, but hopefully through small things like that, can be a better understanding of how to deal with disinformation. I don't know if that answered your question directly about Ukraine, Russia, but
Yeah, kind of. Bert, you have a question?
I was wondering if you could talk about combating misinformation a bit. I really kind of got interested in this about when was it, 2017, that when misinformation just became rampant. And most of the advice about combating misinformation is the kind of stuff that most thinking people would do anyway. How do we combat it so that it doesn't, so that it's not there?
that is slightly above my pay grade. I wish I had the answer for you. I can, again, in a follow-up email to Mohammed, can recommend like organizations that have done a lot of work on this, and that's kind of their specific focus.
I'm sorry, again, could you move a little closer to?
Oh, sorry. I can recommend organizations that have done a lot of work on this, and that's their specific focus. We have not, like that, it's kind of a little bit outside of our safety mandate. We look more at the safety impacts of mis and disinformation on reporters, which are many and varied. But I mean, I think things like media education programs and making sure that people understand what an opinion piece is versus a news article, that sort of thing. I'm not sure. I know as an organization we're not a proponent of any sort of censorship, but I also think that it's helpful to see, this is my personal opinion, to see labels on various social media sites so that you have an understanding of what is motivating perhaps who the person that is writing it, or know that it's flagged as potentially false information. So
I frequently share those graphs that they have of media bias, which seem, you know what I'm talking about. I guess you know what I'm talking about. That shows NPR in the middle and Breitbart out on one side, and so forth. And those graphs, I think, help. I get a good response to those because a lot of people look at them and realize, I didn't know that was a right wing or that was a left wing organization. I thought they were pretty middle of the road. So that kind of helps to combat the information getting to, it helps people to decide where to get their information.
yeah. Oh. Thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have questions? Susie, go ahead.
I think Susie does.
Yeah, she's in.
Yeah, can you unmute yourself? Here, let me see if I can. Okay.
I think she has to be unmuted.
Hey, Susie, can you unmute yourself? You're muted. It's on the left. Oh, there we go.
That should get it.
Yeah.
Okay. I can remember when there was not a large category of people involved in communication with title of fact checker. And a lot of us became fans of Snopes and such. People are beginning to look for the scoop for, okay, who's telling it straight and who's not. And there is a much higher level, it seems like every couple of months, of awareness of just plain disinformation, of things that are put out there simply for the purpose of confusing the audience.
So you're saying that there's a more understanding of disinformation and what it is, or that there's a
I would think people are becoming aware of how much disinformation is out there. They're starting to look for fact checkers. They're starting to look at Snopes. They're starting to be suspicious of sources of information. Sources of information are more and more going to have to show their integrity.
Yeah, it's interesting, slightly tangential, but to go off of this. So one of the organizations that I will recommend in this email to Mohammed that's been really great in dealing with misinformation and disinformation, had this workshop that I attended, and the idea, it was kind of a pre-election simulation of what do you do when all this false information is flying at you on election day, like how do you verify things, that sort of stuff. And the moral of this very kind of fun, kind of crazy long workshop was that you just keep on pushing out the truth, the narrative, the kind of bland, AP Reuters story with all the facts. But you think about how you're coordinating the facts, right? Like, and where you want to stack something in a story. And I think that there was definitely a reckoning in media circles over the past, 4.5 years of how we ended up in that situation, and trying to understand what newsrooms can do proactively to make sure that they're the ones steering the story and not bad faith actors. So I'm hopeful, cautiously optimistic. If anyone can be any cautiously optimistic at this point, but that hopefully at least framing and kind of the continued following the to do the correct path, but it will kind of hopefully help things kind of recalibrate in the next few years.
Does anybody else have any questions? This is the
One,
last one.
yeah, all right. You worked in Ukraine and Russia, and my daughter and her family are moving to Kiev. What is your sense of the situation there? They're moving there in July. We'll be there for 2 years. Do you think that there will be a skirmish of some sort, or do you think things will calm down? What is your, and I just wanted to get, because you probably have sources over there who you stay in touch with, the reason I'm asking.
Well, it's been a few years at this point, but I will just leave you with this anecdote of I bought a one-way ticket to Kiev in 2014 at the height of the protests in January. They were super cheap. I wandered off a metro stop and was sure that the city would be in flames. And I found myself next to a clothing store that was very much functioning. People were going in and out of buying it. And meanwhile, football yard over, there was the whole protest encampment. I think it's really important to remember that what you see on the news is kind of the center of the story, and is perhaps not necessarily reflective of everything that's going on. I will say Kiev is a great city, and it's also quite far away from, a 6-hour train ride away from many of the hotspots going, like in eastern Ukraine. So I don't know, what the situation will be for your daughter, but they're great restaurants. It's a very friendly city. People love Americans. Like, she'll hopefully enjoy it.
Okay. All right. Hey, Catherine, thank you very much for taking the time to be the speaker for our meeting. And would love to have you back maybe, sometime next year, if Ruth will help us. Ruth, do you have something to say? to Catherine?
Keep up the good work. What you and your partner organizations are doing is just really crucial right now. So we all appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys so much for caring. It's really kind of nice to see people across the country who are invested in these issues. So thank you guys so much for taking the time on your Monday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Take care.
And to all the members and the guests, our next meeting is on 5th of July, same time. And we are working hard to get a really good speaker for the July meeting also.
Okay. We'll see you later.
Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You all
Bye.
take care. Bye-bye.